I've come to the personal conclusion that I actually want the country to see who I am, who I really am. But I don't know what the result of that will be. But for me personally, I'd rather be successful or unsuccessful based on who I really am, not based on some plastic Ken doll that you put up in front of audiences. That's not me, you know?
Hi, this is Ed Driscoll. Welcome to Silicon Graffiti. Back around Christmas of 2005, Umberto Eco wrote, quote, "We are supposed to be living in a skeptical age. In fact, we live in an age of outrageous credulity," unquote. Nowhere is that more apparent than the John Edwards scandal, which finally broke into the mainstream media on Friday. And MSNBC's David Schuster is mad.
You're only as good as the sources and the people you rely on, but when you have some very credible people working for John Edwards essentially telling you, you will be ashamed of yourself if you go with this story and you're only a couple of months before the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, and you make the decision based on your trust of those people working for John Edwards that they're speaking truthfully, at least to the extent that they know, I mean, it's a big deal.
Yes, you heard right. A cynical, hard-bitten journalist is astonished that those closest to a political candidate would circle the wagons and lie to the media. But the media are more than willing to circle the wagons themselves, as Byron York wrote the day before the ABC story on Edwards broke. In today's news environment, executives have to take more explicit steps than in the past if they want to rein in stories. Journalists have multiple platforms. They might mention a story in a newspaper article, a web piece, in a blog, on video, on television, or on radio. For news executives to make sure the Edwards story does not appear on any of an organization's several platforms, they have to make sure that tight controls are in place. The Edwards story is not invisible by accident." Unquote. The media is quick to report any flaw, real or imagined, of a conservative. But once a man of the left breaks through to become a national name, his past is almost always sanitized. As I mentioned in our last edition of Silicon Graffiti, the Swiftettes became an issue in 2004 because the media did their damnedest to bottle up this moment from 1971.
They told the stories of times that they had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blown up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, raised villages in fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, shot cattle and dogs for fun.
And to this day, the media use the phrase swift boating as a pejorative, because the Swiftettes dared mention history the MSM had long bottled up, something which makes the media quite cross. As would any conservative referring to New York City as Hymietown, and quite rightly so. But at least until this recent moment, and actually probably for long afterwards, Jesse Jackson was a media darling, including hosting his own show on CNN for 8 years, long after his infamous remark in 1984. Michael Moore is another example. Before he became a media fixture, Pauline Kael discussed the myriad of flaws and fabrications in his 1989 movie Roger and Me, explaining that what appeared to be an objective documentary was anything but. The movie's equivalent of Alfred Hitchcock's MacGuffin, the element that drives the plot forward, is that Moore can't get an interview with Roger Smith, then the CEO of General Motors. But as Debbie Melnick and Rick Kane, producers of Manufacturing Descent, told Tucker Carlson,
well, one of the interesting things we found out, which was actually quite surprising, and we found this out close to the end of our filmmaking process, was that Michael had actually talked to Roger Smith, the CEO of General Motors, and actually had interviewed him for the film Roger and Me, but it ended up on the cutting room floor and it wasn't in the final edit, the final cut of the film.
Wait, but the whole point of the film was that he wasn't able to talk to Roger because Roger wasn't kind enough to speak to him.
Right, but he did. So that was a bit shocking, and that really disappointed me a lot.
And his 2002 film, Bowling for Columbine, was riddled with a similarly altered timeline and equally tenuous grasp on history. But that film came in the midst of a period in which Moore's career path was undergoing a remarkable upswing. In the early days after September 11th, Jacob Weisberg of the liberal e-zine Slate wrote that Moore was considered a well-known crank, quote, regarded with considerable distaste even on the left, unquote. However considerable it may have been, somehow the left managed to put their distaste aside by June 23rd of 2004, when almost the entire left half of the Senate attended the opening night of Fahrenheit 9/11. 1 month later, Moore was sitting next to a former president of the United States at the Democrats' National Convention. Just like Michael Moore, Al Sharpton did something that should be anathema to most journalists. He faked news. The 1988 Tawana Brawley story was a complete fabrication, as Stephen Pagonis, then assistant director in Dutchess County, New York, explained to Sean Hannity.
Now, the grand jury issued a report. It was a grand jury report, said there was no evidence that any sexual assault had occurred in this case by anybody.
Correct.
But that didn't stop the allegations against you.
No. In fact, after that grand jury report came out, I held a press conference and I stated publicly that I was going to bring a defamation action against Mason, Maddox, Sharpton, and Tawana Brawley for the allegations that they made.
But the Tawana Brawley story seems to have never happened in the minds of most TV news producers, nor did Democratic presidential hopefuls Al Gore and Bill Bradley in the midst of the 2000 primaries, each of whom paid visits to Sharpton's New York headquarters, hat metaphorically in hand, looking for Sharpton's support. Sharpton himself would, of course, make a quixotic run for the White House in 2004. And if the media were willing to play dead for John Edwards, a runner-up in 2008, it goes without saying that a similar dynamic is at work with the winner of this year's Democratic primaries. Here's Soledad O'Brien of CNN discussing Reverend Wright's speech to the NAACP on April 27, 2008.
It was an illuminating speech. It was a really funny, not angry, interesting, dynamic speech. So certainly a home run for him from that perspective.
But 1 week later, during which Barack Obama famously threw Reverend Wright under the proverbial bus, CNN's John Roberts told Obama that
we are declaring a Reverend Wright free zone today, so no questions about Reverend Wright. Our viewers want us to move on, so this morning we're going to move on. Is that okay with you?
Fair enough.
All right.
That sounds just fine.
Somewhere, off stage, Richard Nixon is chuckling in wry bemusement, both that an establishment media that turned up the burners on his administration is willing to roll over and play dead whenever a candidate on the left needs his record massaged. And that there are still people left who believe that the legacy media is objective when they're merely human, and their own emotions and desire to see their favorite candidate succeed often get the better of them, no matter how much they deny it. But then, as Glenn Reynolds wrote on Friday, there are two Americas, the real one and the one the press tries to bob off on us. For Silicon Graffiti, I'm Ed Driscoll.